How could a young woman once dismissed as nothing more than trash rise to the throne of one of the most powerful empires in history? Was it beauty, cunning ruthlessness, or some other sorcery that historians have never dared to put into words? That woman was Empress Theodora, wife of the great Justinian, a ruler who stood beside the emperor himself in every major decision of the empire. To many, Theodora was an enigma, a living paradox. Before she ever stepped into the Hagia Sophia, draped in silks and crowned with gold and jewels, she had been a woman scorned to the very bottom of society, a stage girl of the Hippodrome, a comic actress who made a living from biting satire, a courtesan surviving day by day. That past, both sordid and vividly alive, is what makes her story one people cannot help but crave, even as they try to turn away from it. To uncover the truth, we must trace Theodora's steps from the shadowy streets of this city, where cheap laughter and the sweat of the crowd clung to her skin, to the cold marble steps that led to the imperial throne. It is a journey streaked with both mud and gold, where fact and legend twist together into a rope that has gripped humanity's imagination for over 1,000 years. Before we plunge into this mystery, make sure to subscribe, so you won't miss any of the strange and thrilling journeys through history that lie ahead. In the 6th century, Constantinople stood like a jewel, cut to perfection, gleaming at the crossroads of 2 continents and 2 civilizations. Its grand avenues were paved with marble, the clatter of horse hooves from diplomatic processions echoed between towering walls, and markets overflowed with spices, from India silks, from China, amber, from the Baltic. It was the portrait of an empire in its prime, prosperous, proud, and utterly convinced it was the center of the world. But behind that brilliance rot, spread quietly like mold beneath an ornate carpet. The nobility and officials lived in shameless luxury, squandering fortunes on endless feasts and decadent entertainments, while outside the city gates, the common people crowded into damp slums where the stench of sewage mixed with the sour reek of fish from the harbour thickening the air. Byzantine law, wrapped in the robes of divinity and justice in practice, served only those with wealth and influence. Corruption was not a rare affliction, it was the very blood running through the veins of government. In this world, women were born carrying an invisible sentence. Law and religion bound them so tightly there was barely room to breathe. For a woman outside the aristocracy, life was almost predetermined. Marry someone chosen by circumstance, bear children, raise them, and vanish behind the walls of a household. Those less fortunate without family protection or inheritance might sink into trades deemed impure, from menial labor to selling their bodies to survive. A woman's worth in the eyes of Byzantine society lay not in her intellect or her character, but in her obedience to the order men had built. And in this unforgiving picture, a girl like Theodora appeared not as a heroine favored by fate, but as a faint marginal figure pushed to the edges of every story. Theodora's father, Acacius, was no general or wealthy merchant. He was a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, his work bound to the blood and sweat of great beasts captured from distant forests, trained to perform for roaring crowds. The Hippodrome was more than a circus or a racetrack. It was the beating heart of Constantinople's public life, where politics and spectacle collided in a whirlwind of chaos. The rival blues and greens of chariot racing wielded such influence that at times they could overshadow the emperor himself. Working there, Acacius lived at the edge of glory, close enough to see the gold-threaded robes of the aristocracy, yet far enough to know he would never touch that world. Theodora's childhood was not spent in velvet chambers, but in cramped rooms behind the animal pens where the smell of fur and dung clung to the air. Now and then, she would be taken into the Hippodrome stands, watching chariots tear across the track, at breakneck speed, the roar of the crowd shaking the stone seats. It was there she learned to read people, to spot the gaze of the powerful, to see how they conducted the emotions of the masses like a conductor with a baton. But life rarely lets a poor child dream for long. Around the age of 7, Theodora's father died suddenly. The loss was like a blade severing the thin thread that kept the family steady. Her mother, now with 3 children to feed, clung desperately to the only lifeline she knew: the circus. She remarried a man who trained animals, hoping it would secure her daughters a place in the troupe. But the Hippodrome's world had no space for pity. Opportunities didn't appear just because someone knew your parents. Poverty closed in quickly. Theodora, once just a girl tagging along to the market, began to understand that every evening meal came from concessions and bargains no one spoke of aloud. In the Byzantine social order, once a family slipped to the bottom, their choices were few. For a young girl, they were fewer still and harsher. In the eyes of the aristocracy, the daughter of a bearkeeper could never escape the smell of the cages. Beauty, wit, resourcefulness, none of it erased the stain of her origins. Constantinople was a city of contradictions. It could give one person everything, yet strip another of even the right to dream. In wealthy districts, noblewomen learned letters, embroidery, and the art of subtle political games behind silken curtains. In the darker alleys, women were remembered only when they became commodities traded, bought, or discarded. Fairy tales rarely began in such places, and if they did, they usually ended before anyone realized they were living one. For Theodora, the ruthless game of fate began early. She did not get to choose the board or the pieces, but in those years at the bottom, watching from the margins and surviving on wit instead of privilege, the seed of a quiet ambition took root. An ambition no one yet knew, no one yet saw, but one day it would grow strong enough to shake the throne of the Byzantine Empire itself. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was more than just an architectural marvel. It was the city's pounding heart, where life itself seemed to keep time with the roar of the crowd, the thunder of hooves on packed earth, and wagers so high they could turn a pauper into a prince in the span of a few laps. Nearly 400 meters long, it was a vast arena where tens of thousands crammed into tiered stone seats, splitting themselves into two great factions, the blues and the whites cheering for their champions while quietly signaling their political loyalties, their religious allegiances, and even their personal fortunes. Under the searing noon sun or the flicker of torchlight after dusk, the Hippodrome became a massive furnace heat and humanity fusing into the heavy breath of the empire itself. Beneath the glitter of the races, however, lay another world, one few in polite society would ever admit to loving. Behind the scenes in damp canvas tents reeking of rope leather saddles and cheap wine actors, singers and dancers powdered their faces, adjusted their costumes and waited for their turn to entertain the masses. The spectacles stretched far beyond chariot races or wrestling matches. There were bawdy comedies, suggestive dances, and on occasion performances that history's pen has blurred with euphemism. It was here that Theodora first appeared, not as a star, but as a stagehand fetching props or serving the main performers. The Hippodrome was not the kind of place that let anyone stay still for long. To survive, you had to adapt, learn to laugh at the right moment, say the words that loosened purse strings, or at the very least, make yourself unforgettable. With her wide dark eyes and uncanny knack for mimicking voices, Theodora soon caught the attention of the troupe's managers. From silent background roles, she was pushed into small speaking parts, usually as a maid, a courtesan, or some character meant to draw a laugh. In Byzantium, a woman on the stage was almost always assumed to be for sale. Acting and sex work were treated as two sides of the same coin, an unspoken truth accepted by audiences and performers alike. For Theodora, the line between the two blurred quickly. She became part of the wine-soaked after-parties, where drunken noblemen issued commands disguised as flirtation, expecting her to comply with the silent contract everyone understood, but no one said aloud. The irony was that the same society that despised women like Theodora was also helplessly drawn to them. They were deemed impure, barred from sacred ceremonies, forbidden to marry into the upper classes. Yet they were the subject of endless rumor, the whispers that floated through public baths, the satirical sketches traded in taverns. Theodora, quick-witted and keen-eyed, understood that this strange space between disdain and fascination was one she could step into and make her own. Every night on stage was a lesson in observation. She learned to see the audience not as a faceless mass, but as clusters of individuals, each with their own gaze reactions and status. She noticed how officials in the front row leaned in to whisper when a joke brushed too close to politics, or how a wealthy merchant's applause grew louder if a scene turned suggestive. To most, these were just instincts of the trade. To Theodora, they were a map of power. She trained her voice to carry to the farthest seat, learned to pause just long enough to spark a laugh or a whistle. More importantly, she learned when to step off the stage and melt into the crowd, listening to stories spilled in drunken confidence, who owed whom, who hated whom, who was quietly looking for an ally. In a society where information was currency, Theodora was building her own fortune not in gold, but in secrets. The circus world was far from safe. Rivalries between actors, dancers, even animal keepers, often ended in petty sabotage or violent brawls in the shadows. Theodora learned to defend herself, not only with sharp words, but with the ability to choose the right allies at the right time. She knew when to bow her head to avoid trouble, and when to strike to protect her place. To outsiders, she was just another face on the stage, surviving on smiles and coquettish glances. But here at the very bottom of society, in the haze of torch smoke and stale wine, she was honing the skills that would one day make ministers and foreign envoys think twice before underestimating her. The Hippodrome, with all its chaos and grime, was Theodora's first school of politics. It was here she learned that power didn't only reside in the hands of those in golden robes. It lived in well-timed whispers, in secrets kept close in the art of letting someone believe they were in control, while in truth, it was you pulling the strings. In the eyes of the crowd, Theodora was just another woman destined to fade once her beauty dimmed. But in her own mind, a larger plan was already taking shape. She didn't know how far she would go, only that this stage, even if it had been the birthplace of humiliation, would also be the place she learned to step out of the shadows and into the rare light that only a handful of women in all of history had ever reached. The first great turning point in Theodora's life didn't happen under the bright lights of the Hippodrome. It began with a journey that seemed full of promise, but quickly unraveled into years of harsh exile. Barely past girlhood, she left Constantinople in the company of a minor official, bound for North Africa, lured by the promise of a better future, perhaps even an escape from the mire of the stage. For a girl scorned by polite society, that promise felt like a door flung open to an entirely new world. But it didn't last. The man who had once clasped her hand as they left the city turned his back on her, abandoning her in a foreign land, with nothing, no money, no friends, no shelter, betrayed and alone. Theodora had to carve out her own survival in a place that owed her no kindness. North Africa, with its dry, punishing climate and bustling port cities, offered little space for pity. She scraped together a living through odd jobs, cleaning inns, serving in wealthy households, quickly learning that her position was as disposable as any object. If she wanted to avoid starvation, she would have to adapt, and adapt fast. She picked up the subtle art of bargaining for an extra scrap of food, a few coins, or even the right to rest in a safer corner for the night. From North Africa, her reluctant journey stretched across other lands, Syria, Palestine, and finally Egypt. Each left its own mark on her. In Syria, she saw thriving market towns where goods from east and west converged, and yet she also saw how easily that prosperity could vanish. One plague, one war, and it was gone. In Palestine, she lived near austere religious communities, hearing Bible stories read aloud in small gatherings. For the first time, she found herself reflecting on life's fragility, on how honor and wealth were far from the only measures of a person's worth. Egypt held her the longest, and it was here that the deepest shift in her thinking began. She came into closer contact with Christianity, especially ascetic and monastic traditions. The clergy she met did not look at her solely through the lens of sin. They listened. They spoke to her of redemption, of how no one was fated to remain in darkness forever, and how even the most lost could find light through repentance and change. For someone long dismissed as the refuse of society, those words felt strange, but also dangerously compelling. Theodora never became a zealous convert. but she absorbed enough of these ideas to use them as a new framework for understanding herself and the world. She stopped raging blindly at fate and began to treat each misfortune as a lesson. Betrayal in North Africa taught her never to put all her trust in a single person. Hunger in Syria taught her how to stretch the barest resources. The austerity of Palestine taught her that life could be lived without total dependence on material wealth. And in Egypt she learned that patience and the ability to read people could open doors brute force never would. These wandering years sharpened a will she never knew she possessed. The impulsive young girl became a woman who could mask her thoughts, choose the right moment to speak, or remain silent, feign weakness when it would earn help, and show steel when someone tried to take advantage. In Constantinople, such skills might have only kept her afloat in the theatre world. Out here, they were tools for navigating an infinitely harsher arena. The farther she travelled, the more she learned to read power at every level. She saw provincial officials vie for influence as viciously as court factions in the capital merchants, betraying one another the moment profit was at risk, marriages arranged purely to bind fortunes and secure position. From this, she drew one quiet rule: everything is a transaction, no matter how much it's dressed up in religion, honor, or love. Anyone who understood that rule would never be entirely surprised by betrayal and might even turn it to their advantage. It was during this time that Theodora forged a near-absolute self-reliance. With no one to lean on, she became her own steward, managing her meager money, negotiating her work, and deciding when to leave before danger closed in. That independence meant she was no longer a passenger swept along by life's current, but a navigator choosing her own route, however treacherous it might be. By the time her exile drew to a close, Theodora was nothing like the girl who had left Constantinople. Once dependent on others' pity or desire for survival, she now defined her own worth. She was no longer merely a product of fate, she was its architect. Every wound, every humiliation, every cold night in a strange land had become a piece of armor, forming a woman who was sharper, more resilient, and ready for whatever games of power awaited her. And just when she had begun to feel at home in her life abroad, another call began to stir, a pull back to the city that had both shaped and shattered her youth. Constantinople was not only where she had been born, but also the largest, most dangerous, and most opportunity-rich stage of all. There her past and future would collide, and everything she had learned in exile would face its ultimate test. When the ship docked in Constantinople, the salty, damp air of the Sea of Marmara mixed with the bustle of the harbour, and memories came rushing back like an unexpected wave. But this time, Theodora wasn't returning as the wide-eyed young girl who had left the city years before. She stepped onto the pier with a different presence. No uncertainty in her gaze, only quiet confidence, each stride seeming deliberate, measured. Years in exile had shaped her into a woman with an unshakable core, someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. Constantinople still gleamed with all its splendor, golden church domes glittering in the sun-cobbled streets, alive with merchants and hawkers, and the Hippodrome still at the heart of both entertainment and politics. Yet beneath that brilliance, the city was restless. Factions quietly wrestled for power, the wealthy grew richer, and the common people scraped by in the shadows. In this world of contradictions, Theodora sensed an opportunity to use everything she had learned to carve out a place for herself. It didn't take long for her to draw the attention of the city's elite, not only for her beauty, but for the way she spoke, the way she steered a conversation. She was no longer the cheap entertainer of the Hippodrome. She was a woman who listened, observed, and could shift the tone of an exchange with the smallest, sharpest reaction. That subtle skill soon brought her into the orbit of a man destined to become the center of the empire, Justinian, the nephew of Emperor Justin I. When they first met, Justinian was not yet emperor, but he was already among the most powerful figures in the court, ambitious, astute, and unyielding, with a vision to expand the empire's reach and tighten imperial control. Their connection quickly grew beyond polite conversation. Justinian wasn't only drawn to Theodora's beauty and charm. He recognized her keen intellect and political insight. They spoke of more than affection. They discussed law, religion, and the art of rule itself. But the path from lover to empress was anything but smooth. Byzantine law forbade high-ranking officials, especially those of imperial blood, from marrying actresses or women from professions deemed impure. Theodora's past, no matter how far behind her, was a stain the conservative aristocracy would never forget. To them, Justinian marrying her was not just unlawful, it was an affront to imperial dignity. Yet Justinian was not a man to let the law stand in the way of his aims. With Theodora's counsel, he began to push for change. It wasn't merely a romantic gesture, it was a calculated political move. Amending the law would not only clear the way for their marriage, it would also show that Justinian could bend the system to his will, a sign of strength essential for any ruler. The battle to rewrite the law was quiet but fierce. Justinian needed to win over not only Emperor Justinian but also influential voices in the imperial council and the church. Theodora, though absent from the formal meetings, worked behind the scenes. She advised on how to approach each power group. The clergy needed tales of repentance and moral transformation, while the nobility had to be assured that she would not disrupt the existing order. In the end, the law was changed, clearing the path for their marriage. It was more than a personal victory for Theodora and Justinian. It was a bold political statement. What had once seemed immutable in the law could be altered with enough will and influence. For Theodora, it was proof that the past did not have to shackle the present, that even those deemed the lowest could ascend to the highest ranks of power. Their wedding was no fairy tale, but rather a spectacle watched with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion across the empire. Some saw it as proof that love could overcome any barrier. Others saw only the audacity, even recklessness of Justinian. Either way, no one could deny that Theodora had entered the imperial game with a masterstroke. From her new position as future empress, Theodora began preparing for the role ahead. She did not focus solely on her appearance or court etiquette. She studied politics, law, and the web of influence within and beyond the palace. She understood that the title of empress was not just an honor, but a perilous responsibility. One misstep could make her a prime target for those who sought to undermine Justinian. These months marked Theodora's full transformation from a survivor of the streets to a strategist in the heart of imperial power. She no longer waited for fate's blows. She set the pieces herself. And she knew the marriage to Justinian was only the beginning. Ahead lay an empire with its intrigues, rebellions, and trials that would decide whether she would be remembered as a formidable empress or dismissed as a woman who stumbled onto the throne by chance. In the golden light of a Constantinople sunset, as the city quieted under the last cries of the marketplace, Theodora stood at the window of her new palace, gazing at the rising dome of the Hagia Sophia under construction. She knew that from this moment forward, every step she took would shape not only her destiny, but the fate of the Byzantine Empire itself. And after everything she had endured, she was ready to keep moving, unafraid of whatever game lay ahead. That morning, the church bells of Constantinople rang out not just to herald a grand ceremony, but as if to remind the empire that it stood on the edge of an extraordinary moment. The wedding of Justinian and Theodora, a woman who had once made her living on the Hippodrome stage, was an event without precedent. Inside the palace, deep crimson velvet curtains were drawn back to reveal the splendor of the great hall where the ceremony would take place. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting golden blue and red patterns that shimmered across the marble floor. The nobility sat rigid and composed, their eyes cold or glinting with veiled meaning, as if each was privately deciding whether this was a tragedy or a farce. They did not look at Theodora as a future empress, but as an intruder in their sacred domain. Their disdain was thinly veiled, if at all, for they believed her past would forever cling to her like a shadow. The church, a power no less formidable than the throne, was equally uneasy. Some clergy stood firm in their opposition, invoking moral codes and ancient laws to object. A former actress on the imperial throne, they warned, would set a dangerous precedent, diminishing the dignity of the crown and blurring the line between court and commoner. Yet with the unyielding backing of Justinian, These voices of disapproval could not turn into a force strong enough to block the union. Theodora knew that on her wedding day she was also stepping onto a hidden battlefield. She had no illusions that a lavish ceremony or a jewel-studded crown would make the world forget where she came from. On the contrary, she understood that she would need to prove herself from the very first days as Empress, or risk being quietly pushed to the margins of power. Almost immediately after the wedding, she plunged into the work of managing the imperial court, a labyrinth of ceremony politics and personal intrigue. The Byzantine palace was more than a royal residence. It was a nerve center where alliances were made and broken in whispers. Every maid, every official in charge of ceremony or finances could be a key piece in the game of power. With a sharp memory and an uncanny ability to read people, Theodora quickly learned who was loyal, who was an opportunist, and who might be a threat. Her ambitions did not end at the palace walls. Theodora skillfully extended her reach into the imperial council itself, not through grand displays but by cultivating quiet, deliberate relationships. At small gatherings, she would speak little and listen much, memorizing each tidbit of information, each buried grievance between factions tools she could later wield with precision. What surprised many was that Theodora did not hide from her past. She never denied her years on the Hippodrome stage. At times she even spoke of them as proof of her rise from hardship. When she recalled those days, it was not with shame but with a wry humor that could make her audience either laugh or fall silent. Over time, her refusal to flinch in the face of her own history began to disarm some of her critics. Attacking her past, they realized, was no longer an effective weapon. In matters of governance, Theodora was decisive and pragmatic. She restructured the palace budget, trimming wasteful extravagance to redirect funds toward charitable projects she believed would strengthen the image of the Empress among the people. She was especially committed to aiding poor women, widows, and orphans, seeing it both as a moral duty and a means of building loyalty. Many women who had once faced ruin much as she once had, now found refuge and a path back to dignity under her patronage. These initiatives did not always please the aristocracy, as they upset long-standing balances of privilege. Yet Theodora balanced concession with firmness, knowing when to yield and when to hold her ground. At banquets, she could smile and exchange pleasantries with former adversaries. But behind that smile, her mind was always calculating. In only a short time after her wedding, her standing transformed. Where once she had been regarded as an infamous outsider, even skeptics began to admit she was a formidable political force. Her strength lay not just in her social skill, but in her long view of power. She knew that it was not only the person on the throne who ruled, but also the one who could shape the hands around it. The moment of widespread acknowledgement came during a major imperial celebration, when Theodora stood before hundreds of officials and clergy to deliver a speech in Justinian's stead. Her voice rang clear and steady, without a trace of hesitation. She pledged loyalty to the emperor and faith in the empire, yet also wove in the subtle but unmistakable message that she would be a guardian of the common good, not merely the interests of one class. When she finished, the entire hall rose to its feet, applause echoing beneath the vaulted dome, and in many eyes there was no longer any trace of that early scorn. From the velvet curtain of her wedding day to the Empress's throne, Theodora's path had been a chain of unrelenting trials. Yet it was precisely these obstacles that forged her resolve, honed her skill, and proved that her rise was not a stroke of luck, but the result of intellect, persistence, and careful strategy. And as she sat beside Justinian, gazing out over the hall awash in light, she knew she had entered history not only as an empress, but as living proof that fate, no matter how merciless, can be bent by the will of those determined to master it. In January of 532, Constantinople was swept into a storm of chaos that history would remember as the Nika Revolt. It began as nothing more than chants from the stands of the Hippodrome, where the rival blue and green factions, usually at each other's throats over chariot races, set aside their feud to protest the empire's taxes and corruption. But within days, the cheers of sport turned into cries for the emperor's overthrow. Fires spread through the city, devouring marketplaces and even the unfinished Hagia Sophia. Inside the palace, the air was thick with fear. Word kept arriving that the mob had surrounded and slaughtered Justinian's closest officials. The pounding footsteps outside sounded like war drums shaking the resolve of even the emperor's guards, who barely dared to lift their heads. Justinian, normally steadfast in rule, now found himself gripped by an unfamiliar unease. He knew the rebels had already named a rival emperor. Staying meant risking not only his own life, but Theodora's as well. His generals and advisors urged him to prepare ships and flee the city. Some had already arranged escape routes, hoping to regroup beyond the walls and muster an army. Justinian seemed ready to agree. After all, survival looked like the only sensible option when every other door had slammed shut. But in that decisive moment, Theodora rose and shattered the suffocating gloom. She did not plead. She did not beg. Her voice was firm, carrying the clarity of someone who had seen the truth of what running away would mean. "If your majesty wishes to leave, then go," she said, her eyes locked on Justinian. "But I will not abandon this throne. For me, the crown is the most beautiful shroud." It was more than defiance in the face of death. It was a blade slicing through the hesitation of everyone present. Theodora understood that abandoning the capital now would mean losing power forever, burying the dynasty's honor in disgrace. She would rather die on the throne than live in exile. Her words swept through the chamber like fire, burning away fear and igniting resolve. Justinian lifted his head, his expression hardening, and issued new orders on the spot. His generals, led by Belisarius and Mundus, were told to rally the loyal troops. A ruthless yet effective plan took shape: lure the rebels back into the Hippodrome with promises of negotiation, then seal the gates and crush the uprising. The next day, the plan was carried out with chilling precision. Tens of thousands poured into the Hippodrome, expecting to hear the emperor's concessions, only to have the great gates slam shut. Soldiers flooded in from every entrance, spears glinting in the torchlight. The screams of the crowd mingled with the clash of steel. Within hours, the city's grand arena had become a killing ground. Chroniclers would later estimate 30,000 dead, a figure so staggering that even the most power-hungry rulers would shudder. When the last cries faded, Constantinople fell into a heavy silence. Smoke still curled upward from the burnt quarters of the city, but Justinian and Theodora's grip on power had been secured beyond question. Fear rippled through both commoners and nobles alike. No one dared challenge the throne openly for years afterward. Theodora did not revel in the bloodshed, but neither did she regret it. In her eyes, it was a necessary sacrifice to save the empire from falling into another's hands, to preserve the great work she and Justinian had begun. From that day forward, she was no longer merely the emperor's wife. She was his co-ruler in all but name, her voice strong enough to shape the empire's most fateful decisions. In the months that followed, the city began to rebuild. The Hagia Sophia, reduced to ashes during the revolt, rose again on a scale never before seen. Justinian provided the vision, but Theodora was deeply involved in selecting its architecture, its artistry, even the organization of its labor. It was as if every block of marble carried a trace of her iron will. Though the people feared the brutality of the suppression, they gradually recognized the stability it brought. Markets reopened, merchants returned, and the heartbeat of the city resumed under the shadow of a stern, unshakable authority. To many, Theodora embodied the cold resolve required to keep order, a woman unafraid to act where powerful men might falter. The Nika revolt, its flames, its blood, was the turning point of Justinian's reign. It transformed Theodora from a rising empress into a symbol of power and determination. Her words, "The crown is the most beautiful shroud," endured not just as a line in the chronicles, but as proof that sheer will could alter the fate of an empire. From then on, no one in the palace ever underestimated her again. Behind that calm gaze, they knew was a heart that had chosen to live and die with the throne. When the smoke and fire of the Nika riots finally faded, and Constantinople entered a period of rebuilding, Theodora did not simply remain a silent partner at Justinian's side. She began pushing for a wave of sweeping reforms, many aimed directly at the place of women in Byzantine society. Scarred by her youth, marked by the jeers she endured in the Hippodrome and the humiliations of life as an actress and courtesan. Theodora understood better than anyone that the laws and customs of the time had bound women in invisible crushing chains. Under her influence, new laws emerged to protect society's most vulnerable. One of her boldest moves was to outlaw forced prostitution entirely and to establish sanctuaries for women escaping that life. She oversaw the creation of a large refuge outside Constantinople called Metanoia, the conversion where hundreds of women were given shelter, food, and training in trades. In a society that saw such women as irredeemable, it was a direct blow to entrenched prejudice. Her vision didn't stop there. She pushed through legislation granting women the right to own property, to inherit, and to take legal action against abusers. Many male officials in the court viewed these measures as a threat to the established order, but Theodora knew the truth. If she did not use her power to rewrite the rules, the chance to protect women might never come again. Alongside social reform, she waded into another equally dangerous battlefield: religion. 6th century Byzantium was riven by bitter theological disputes between Chalcedonian orthodoxy and non-Chalcedonian sects, especially the Monophysites. Justinian leaned toward preserving Chalcedonian doctrine to maintain political unity, but Theodora sympathized with the Monophysites, perhaps seeing them as underdogs in a merciless hierarchy. She secretly gave refuge to Monophysite clergy and monks, housing them in the palace or in monasteries under her control. Some chronicles claim she intervened personally to save religious leaders from execution for opposing the official creed. This made her both revered and distrusted in religious circles, a fearless savior to Monophysite followers, a dangerous subversive to many orthodox leaders. For Theodora, religion and politics were never separate realms. She understood that faith and power were deeply intertwined, and that supporting a religious faction meant cultivating a network of political allies. This careful blending of belief and strategy helped her maintain a secure place beside Justinian, even when enemies surrounded her. To ordinary people, however, Theodora appeared in a very different light. The poor widows, orphans, and women cast aside by society saw her as a queen who listened and intervened. They remembered her not for the splendor of court ceremonies, but for tax reductions, open-door shelters, and the times she appeared in person to resolve grievances. Legends say she even disguised herself to walk through markets, quietly hearing complaints and later sending orders to correct injustices. Yet among contemporary historians, especially those aligned with the nobility and orthodox clergy, she was often portrayed with venom. Procopius, the famous historian, painted her in his Secret History as manipulative, immoral, and cruel. While much of it reads more as political slander than truth, it reflects the hostility of a male elite toward a woman who dared step beyond the boundaries set for her sex. In reality, Theodora embodied the paradox of female power in the ancient world, beloved by the common people for her humanity, and progressive reforms loathed by the ruling elite for disrupting the social order they controlled. Her reforms were more than dry lines of legal text. They were acts of defiance against forces determined to keep women powerless. Looking back, it's clear that Theodora wielded every tool available to her law, religion, and personal networks to carve her name into Byzantine history. Whether loved or hated, she forever altered the status of women in the empire, unlocking doors that had been sealed shut for centuries. More than that, she proved that a woman, even one from the very bottom of society, could shape politics, religion, and the fate of millions if she had the intellect and will to do so. The final years of Theodora's life unfolded beneath a shadow so heavy that not even the golden glow of Constantinople's palaces could lift it. After a lifetime of sweeping social reforms, fierce religious interventions, and resounding political triumphs, her health began to falter, visibly and inexorably. Byzantine chroniclers, few though they were, and often coloured by bias, agree on one thing: her illness was long and relentless. Many modern historians believe she may have suffered from some form of cancer, perhaps of the breast or stomach, an affliction that in the medicine of the 6th century was all but a death sentence. Her illness was more than a personal trial. It was a fracture in the very structure of imperial power. Theodora had been the keystone in the empire's decision-making, the one person Justinian trusted most when the choices were perilous and the stakes immeasurable. As her strength waned, cracks began to show. Factions within the palace moved quietly into position, each waiting for the day the most powerful empress in Byzantine history would no longer be there to hold them in check. Yet even in those last months, Theodora never surrendered her grip on the reins of power. She continued to sign edicts safeguarding women and children, kept correspondence with the monophysite clergy she had long championed, and when her body allowed, appeared at audiences that still required her presence. The image of a pale-faced empress on her throne eyes, as sharp as ever, despite the toll of illness, seared itself into the memories of those who saw her. Death came in the summer of 548 when she was only about 48 years old. On that morning, under the brutal heat of a Constantinople sun, the news spread like wildfire. Market stalls shut down. Those she had once aided gathered before the palace gates, many openly weeping. But in certain noble households, and among some in the Orthodox clergy, there was a quiet tinged with relief, as if a great obstacle had just been cleared from the game board. For Justinian, it was a blow from which he never truly recovered. For more than 2 decades they had been more than husband and wife. They had been political partners, intellectual allies. Theodora had stood by him through moments when the throne itself trembled, through the Nika riots, through the storms of court intrigue tempering his legalistic rigidity with an instinctive grasp of human nature. After her death, Justinian never remarried. He would rule for nearly 20 more years, but those who knew him said the light had gone out of the palace. The grand feasts grew fewer, his public appearances rarer, as though the building itself had lost part of its soul. Her funeral matched her imperial stature, lavish and ceremonial, but not every mourner came with genuine grief. Some officials and churchmen attended out of political decorum, while among the common people, especially women, there was heartfelt mourning. Crowds travelled from distant provinces just to bid farewell to the woman they called their protector. In the years that followed, Theodora's image remained a battlefield of opinion. To some historians and members of the elite, she was still the embodiment of manipulation and ambition, a woman who defied the natural limits of her sex. They saw her as an outsider, a former actress who had clawed her way to the throne through seduction and calculation. For them, her death marked the end of an era in which a woman's influence had stretched far beyond what they believed was proper. But to others, especially those whose lives had been improved by her policies, she was living proof that one's origins did not dictate one's destiny. They remembered her as a queen who never forgot where she came from, a woman who dared to face powers far greater than herself to carve out space for those the world had deemed worthless. Her legacy was, and still is, a paradox. Theodora was both a product of a brutal society and a breaker of its rules. She wielded power to protect the powerless, yet could be ruthless in defending that same power. Compassion and severity lived side by side in her, making her one of the most unpredictable figures in Byzantine history. Viewed through the long lens of history, Theodora's mark on the empire is indelible. The legal reforms she championed shaped the status of women for centuries. The religious networks she supported continued to influence regions far beyond her lifetime. Her name echoed in folk tales painted in shades of admiration and suspicion alike. Her quiet death after a life of storms closed one of the most dramatic chapters in Byzantine history, yet it also opened centuries of debate. Loved or despised, she could not be ignored. From a circus girl in the Hippodrome to the throne of the empire, Theodora left behind a legacy so intricate, no telling of Byzantium can be complete without her name. History, when it speaks of Theodora, is always a fractured mirror, reflecting something dazzling yet distorted. At times, she appears as a saint of justice, a defender of the forsaken, unafraid to challenge the old order and carve new paths for women and the powerless. At other times, she takes the shape of a cunning, cold, and ambitious strategist, willing to use every means at her disposal to keep power firmly in her grasp. Both portraits are true, and it is precisely their coexistence that defines her. Those who see only Theodora's past in the Hippodrome often forget that it was that very past that taught her how to survive, how to read people, how to turn scorn into fuel. Those who see only the Empress on her throne overlook the price she paid to sit there, the years of wandering, of betrayal, of being condemned by society. If we choose only half the story, we will never understand how a woman of such humble beginnings became one of the most powerful figures in the Byzantine Empire. Mud and gold, these were the two elements from which Theodora's throne was forged. Mud, the indelible shame of her past. Gold, the power and glory she seized with her own hands and mind. Many would like to separate the two, to either praise her as a pure symbol or curse her as an opportunist. But history does not allow such neat divisions. It keeps everything, even what the people themselves wished could be forgotten. Perhaps that is why Theodora's story still breathes after nearly 15 centuries. She is not the polished heroine of some flawless legend, but a living, breathing figure full of contradictions, ambition, compassion, and ruthlessness. She forces us to face the truth that those who change the world are rarely pure. More often, they are those who know how to weave together darkness and light to achieve their ends. In the end, when we look back at her life, the question is no longer whether Theodora was good or bad, but whether we can recognize the power of someone who dared to remake herself from the ashes of her own past. For there are thrones built from fragments of memory. People long to bury, but history never forgets. And in history's memory, Theodora still sits there, between the gold of power and the mud of prejudice, staring straight at us, as if to ask, "How will you remember me?"